opening scene of a movie is absolutely crucial in securing the audience's attention and ensuring that they're hooked for whatever is to come. Sometimes this might mean offering up a high-wire action sequence, introducing them to the central characters in a clever and entertaining way, or otherwise letting the audience know what the tone and aesthetic of the movie they're watching actually is. But then there are movies that open with scenes that are really nothing else like the rest of the film. Like, not even a little bit. With that in mind then, I'm Ellie with What Culture, and here are 10 opening movie scenes nothing like the rest of the film. Number 10. G.I. Joe: The Rise of Cobra. When you sit down to watch a G.I. Joe movie, you expect a couple of things above all else. Military fetishism and action figure-shaped men destroying hordes of anonymous goons, right? Paramount's first of 3 failed attempts to make G.I. Joe a hit movie franchise was 2009's The Rise of Cobra, which for the most part focused on ridiculous sci-fi action, hammy performances, silly dialogue, and so on. Pretty much what you'd expect then. This is except for the movie's bizarre opening prologue, which takes place in 1641 France and depicts the ancestor of one of the film's villains, James McCullen, being caught selling weapons to enemies of Louis XIII and being fitted with a hot iron mask as punishment. Though a similar fate ends up befalling McCullen when he's transformed into the masked baddie Destro, the tone and aesthetic of the scene are completely different to the rest of the film. Without even a hint of sci-fi daring-do, you could watch the scene in isolation and assume it was from a more realistic historical thriller, especially considering its harsher, more brutal vibe compared to what follows. Immediately after this, we jarringly shift to the not-so-distant future, where the far sillier and more harmless sci-fi schlock kicks off. Number 9. Mulholland Drive. To be completely fair to David Lynch's Mulholland Drive, it's an amorphous enigma of a movie wrapped inside a riddle by design, and really no two scenes are all that much the same. But the opening 2 minutes are an especially marked diversion from the uneasy surrealism that pervades throughout the rest of the picture. The opening scene is a peppy, upbeat montage of couples dancing the jitterbug, composited somewhat garishly against a purple background before we catch a glimpse of protagonist Diane seemingly emerging the victor of the dance-off. Like everything else in Lynch's film, the precise meaning of this scene is elusive, and the director wouldn't have it any other way, but it's certainly a moment quite unlike anything else in this dark, dreamy mystery noir. Number 8. Kindergarten Cop. Kindergarten Cop is one of Arnold Schwarzenegger's more entertaining forays into big, broad studio comedy territory. And though the bulk of the movie is a shamelessly goofy comedy about an oversized cop, John Kimball, going undercover as an elementary school teacher, you'd barely know it from the opening sequence. The first 15 minutes of the movie sees Kimball capturing drug kingpin Cullen Crisp after he murders a man, and then forcing his way into a drug den to track down an addict who witnessed the killing. This toe-curlingly sleazy scene sees Arnie stalking through the den with a shotgun, knocking out anyone who gets in his way and firing off rounds to intimidate the remaining thugs. It feels like a scene from an R-rated cop thriller, not a PG-13 comedy most of the family can enjoy. Almost the entire rest of the movie is a silly comedy about a class of kids getting the better of Man Mountain Arnie, and even when it whips back around to thriller territory again at the end, the tone isn't nearly as downcast and gritty as this. Rest in peace, Ivan Reitman, you absolute madman. Few filmmakers could get away with such ridiculous tonal shifts. Number 7. Superman 3. Superman 3 is certainly much sillier than the first 2 entries into the franchise, though its opening title sequence takes us to a whole other level by descending into pure, unadulterated slapstick. The scene is a thoroughly ridiculous Rube Goldberg-style cacophony of unfortunate accidents happening to the citizens of Metropolis. A guy walks into a lamppost, phone booths are knocked over, toy penguins get set on fire, a blind man commandeers a road painting machine, a guy robs a bank, and a car crashes into a fire hydrant, inexplicably causing the car to fill with water and requiring Superman to save the day. That's not to say the scene isn't somewhat amusing, particularly a photo booth gag that mocks the fact that nobody can tell Supes and Clark Kent apart, but it's also unbearably daft at times. And even for the standards of a Superman movie, starring Richard Pryor is orders of magnitude more ridiculous than the rest of it. Number 6. Con Air. Con Air is one of the most ludicrously entertaining and straight-up ludicrous actioners of the late 90s, and few would deny that it's an unapologetically corny genre flick bolstered by its excellent ensemble cast and thrilling set pieces. There's certainly a tonal consistency to the film, except for a brief opening scene that feels unmistakably like it was stapled catapulted to the front of it by a studio executive. The first minute of the movie is an odd montage of real-life footage of Army Rangers on maneuvers, set to a voiceover narration from the late Great Powers Booth, extolling the Rangers' virtues as soldiers before we cut to protagonist Cameron Poe saluting as he's honorably discharged. This hurried sequence feels far more like it belongs in a military propaganda movie like Act of Valor than a Jerry Bruckheimer action flick, especially considering how hastily thrown together it looks. The army footage was presumably pulled from a stock video library somewhere, and though Booth's narration is supposed to be addressing Poe and his fellow soldiers, he never physically appears on screen at all because it was clearly recorded deep in post-production. The movie could have just as easily started with Poe arriving home in Alabama to his wife Trisha, but instead there's this strange scene tacked on to the start. Number 5. Home Alone 3. The first two Home Alone movies may be plenty ridiculous, but they also do a fantastic job of immediately immersing us in the palpable chaos of the McAllister family before, of course, young Kevin is left to fend off two buffoonish thieves by himself. Home Alone 3 may get lumped in with its direct-to-video successors, yet despite Culkin not returning, it actually had a theatrical release and a bigger budget than either of the first two films. This perhaps explains why the film features a bizarre and bloated opening sequence which sets up the convoluted circumstances through which Alex Pruitt has to defend his home from a quartet of dim-witted invaders. In painfully protracted fashion, we see a group of terrorists attempting to smuggle a $10 million microchip through San Francisco International Airport by hiding it inside an RC car. However, the luggage gets mixed up with an RC car intended for Alex, sending the criminals to his house in the hope of recovering the high-priced technology. Except the opening 10 minutes of the movie don't even remotely feel like a Home Alone film. The shadowy, tense chit-chat between the criminals and their associates feels more like a 90s tech thriller than a comedy written by John Hughes. Only after this baffling, drawn-out opening do we finally meet Alex, and the rest of the movie follows the series' more conventional blueprint, the bad guys getting knocked out and beaten up in a variety of creative ways. It certainly feels more like a Home Alone movie after that opening scene, just not a very good one. Number 4. The Exorcist. Sometimes polar opposite opening scenes are used for intentionally contrasting effect, and that's certainly true of William Friedkin's horror masterpiece The Exorcist. The movie's 10-minute prologue sequence takes place in northern Iraq as Father Merrin takes part in an archaeological dig which uncovers an artifact of the demon Pazuzu, and at the end of the sequence Merrin also encounters a large statue of Pazuzu. It's made abundantly clear that Merrin is extremely disturbed by the figures, and yet this part of the movie doesn't have any direct connection to Regan's subsequent possession in Georgetown, as takes up the rest of the story. The prologue certainly acquaints us with the notion of an evil demonic presence and Merrin's familiarity with it, but from its sun-kissed aesthetics through to its uniquely chilly atmosphere, it's really nothing like the rest of the film. Number 3. K2. K2 is just one of several mountaineering thrillers produced during the 1990s, and it's certainly not one of the better ones. It's no cliffhanger anyway. The film is a dramatization of the first two Americans to climb the titular mountain, fictionalized here as weekend warriors Taylor Brooks and Harold Jameson. And while a solid 95% of the movie is focused on climbing and the surrounding dramas, the opening scene is something totally different. We're pointlessly treated to almost 5 minutes of Brooks and Jameson drunkenly goofing around with two girls they pick up, culminating in Brooks using his climbing skills to vault up to their bedroom window. The scene confirms to us that Brooks is the thrill seeker of the pair, while Jameson is the more bookish nerd. But honestly, the rest of the movie does that in the more appropriate venue of, actual mountain climbing. What a strange waste of time. Number 2. A Serious Man. A Serious Man is one of the Coen brothers' greatest movies, a deliciously savage black comedy set in 1960s Minnesota about a Jewish man, Larry Gopnik, questioning his faith as his life begins to systematically crumble. But before this, the film is front-loaded with a tangential yet brilliant opening sequence set in a 19th century Eastern European Jewish town, where a husband returns home with a man claiming to be an acquaintance of his wife. However, the wife announces that the man has been dead for 3 years and that this individual must in fact be a dibuk, a malicious spirit impersonating him. The man laughs off her accusation, but she stabs him in the chest with an ice pick, after which he leaves the house and his fate remains uncertain. After this, the credits roll and we flash forward to the main story. And though there's certainly thematic DNA shared between the opening and the rest of the movie, namely regarding the nature of faith, doubt, and uncertainty, it's still a massive gear shift. From the earlier time period to the more fable-like dialogue and of course the 4:3 screen ratio, this opening scene is basically a brilliant little short film that the Coens were good enough to attach to their existential black comedy, even if it was certainly a head-scratcher on an initial viewing. Number 1. The Aquatine Hunger Force : movie film for theaters. Cult animated TV series Aquatine Hunger Force certainly has a unique sense of humor, but even so, who could have seen the 2007 movie adaptation kicking off like this? Before we're reacquainted with Master Shake, Frylock, and Meatwad, the film begins with a hilariously deranged parody of a cinema PSA, where a gang of old-timey anthropomorphic movie snacks politely ask you to be considerate of others around you watching the film. The snacks soon enough stumble upon a gang of alternative humanoid snacks, a pretzel, meatball, carton of milk, and nacho, who attack them before playing a belter of a heavy metal song about cinema etiquette. The hilariously R-rated tune includes lyrics such as, "If you make out here, I will off your lips and tongue from your head with a linoleum knife. Your money is now our money and we will spend it on drugs. And best of all, did you bring your baby? Babies don't watch this. Take the seed outside. Leave it in the streets. Run over it after the show." The song ends with a threat to anyone who pirates the movie that they will tear their wife in half. The rest of the film is pretty much exactly what fans would expect from a big-screen Aquatine Hunger Force adventure, but that legendary opening is something else entirely.